How deep does the rot run in our banking sector?
Good afternoon, Temekile. I think that the rot runs fundamentally quite deeply, both in South Africa's financial sector, but also I would argue the global financial sector. You know, in the sequence before this one, you were speaking about the 2008 financial crisis. And we only have to go back as far as that to realize a financial sector that essentially lied to the world and got away with it. The regulators and the ratings agencies that we look at so keenly now to inform our image on South Africa failed to rein in the banks in 2008, and it led to global ruin. And I think if we take it from the global outlook to the local outlook, what we see is that the Guptas were able, and not just the Guptas, a range of different actors, are often able to construct a systematic and complex network of companies and bank accounts in order to undertake illicit transactions. Whether it's the Guptas or Marcus Jooste at Steinhoff, they require bank accounts and they require auditors to look the other way. And I think what the Corporation and Economic Crime Report aims to do is it aims to take a wide range of case studies, from the Gupta banks to the case of VBS, the social grant scandal, and says, what are the commonalities that we see here? And as I've said, those commonalities are that the banking system, in terms of picking up illicit transactions, is failing dismally. Auditing firms are failing us in terms of keeping corporations and holding them to account. And then the final thing to mention, I think is really important, is that while we look to the financial sector and we should hold them accountable, our state regulators are failing to do that. You know, the failure of the Hawks, the prosecuting authority, to really take on corporations where there is evidence of illegality is a fundamental failure that we need to hold the state to, and we need to demand that they do better.
You've written, Michael, about how banks were key facilitators in the Gupta's attempts to control the country's economy, which contradicts, doesn't it, that statement 2 years ago when the big banks in the country essentially came out to say, we will not do any further business with Gupta individuals or Gupta-linked businesses. Is it fair to say that your reading of the situation is that the banks were not genuine in that move?
I think that what we're arguing is that that statement came far too late. If we look at some of the great work done by investigative journalists on the Gupta leaks, what we see is illegality and criminality going back to 2011 and often before that there were highly suspicious transactions, that Gupta-related entities were able to move money between themselves at will, and to do a range of other illicit activities. And what we would argue is that the big South African banks, in particular, made the call to close those accounts when the reputational risk to them became too high, and not when they should have identified that there was systemic risk of criminality. And we would have asked them to do better due diligence up front. I think that's the first thing to say. And then I think the other thing to say is that there are other actors, and there's evidence that this continued long after some of the stories started to break. So if we look at the Bank of Baroda that continued operating with Gupta-related companies, they relied on Nedbank, a large South African bank, for the infrastructure in order to maintain those bank accounts and keep making payments. And we look at one of the largest global banks in the world, HSBC, continue to facilitate accounts and payments for Gupta-related entities long after they should have been aware that there were politically exposed persons within those companies and that there was evidence, once again, of illegality. And I think far too often there's a mea culpa from the companies, whether it's an auditing firm or a bank, long after the horse is bolted. And what we need is I think we need a better regulatory framework. We need tighter laws on issues like beneficial ownership so that it's easier for us as the public to know who is behind a given company. And also we need to look at the regulators that do exist, the Financial Intelligence Center and others, and what is happening when they are flagging and identifying suspicious transactions, and where our regulators then fail to act on that evidence.
You've also done something else with this research that a lot of research and investigations in this country have been criticized for not doing. You've gone as far back as the apartheid era to trace just how complicit banks were in wrongdoing during that time. And I'm curious about the similarities between what was going on then and what we're seeing now, and whether any lessons have been learned over the few decades that we've now transitioned into a democratic South Africa.
So the reason that we go back to apartheid, as you rightly say, is to identify the sort of patterns, not only of behavior, patterns of conduct, but secondly, patterns of impunity for that conduct. So when we think about the Gupta story or the VBS story, we hear stories of shell companies, secret transactions, international bank accounts. Now, that system was perfected by the apartheid regime. Between 1977 and 1994, the apartheid regime built up a very complex money laundering network with the help of international banks, particularly in Belgium and Luxembourg, in order to move money secretly out of the country in order to buy weapons to prop up that regime. And if we look at that sophisticated network and some of the networks of criminality now, there are huge parallels, I think. So that's the first thing to state. But then the second reason that we raise that is that we would argue that one of the great failures of our transition in South Africa is our failure to grapple with the facts, with those facts, essentially, is that we failed to take corporations that were complicit in the crime of apartheid and demand that they account and atone for their actions, that they were held accountable, and that they offered a full truth-telling for their role in that regime. And our failure to do that, both in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and by the MPA prior to that, has largely invisibilized the role of the private sector, both domestically and internationally, in that time. And I think the great risk of that is we now enter into a democratic South Africa, that we look at some of the scandals that are around us and we say, well, how did we get here? How did this suddenly come about? Whereas really we should understand it as a longer tail of corporate criminality, and also as a consequence of not holding them to account. You know, private actors in the financial sector and elsewhere, and large corporations, they have a large number of resources, and they have the ability to spin a public narrative that often presents themselves as victims rather as being complicit in these crimes. And I think our failure to really bring them into the spotlight has been an issue. And to also add and to finish on that, it's one of the goals of the Corporation and Economic Crime Report is to say we're not going to allow powerful bankers, auditing firms, and corporations more broadly to hide in the shadows to minimize their role. We're going to gather the evidence that we and other investigators have raised, and we're going to put it in the public domain, and we're going to demand that those corporations account for their conduct and explain why they shouldn't be held accountable for their role in these crimes.
Michael Merchant, so many more themes to explore, but we'll have to leave it there for today. We'll no doubt have you on at another time to talk further